The house where I spent my childhood was right next to a set of bustling railroad tracks. From my bedroom window, I could see the trains pass by every day. Those tracks carried 3 kinds of trains, and they still do. There were the long, heavy freight trains pulling boxcars, flatbeds, and tankers, which I loved to count as they rattled past. Then there were the swift commuter trains run by the Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, or just the M, as many called it TAND, the Amtrak passenger trains that glided effortlessly to and from Central Station, nestled in the heart of the city. To most people, trains are just massive machines rolling along endless tracks. But to me, they were symbols of freedom, gateways to adventures far beyond the neighborhood I called home. Each time I saw a train, I imagined the distant places it had been and the destinations it was headed toward. As a little kid, my favorite toys were, of course, my Thomas the Tank Engine figures. I had the whole gang: Thomas, Percy, Gordon, James, Toby, Daisy, every single one. When I turned 10, my grandparents gave me a Lionel train set for my birthday. To this day, I still think it was the best gift ever. The set came with a steam engine and 4 passenger cars. It even included a small bottle of liquid you could pour into the smokestack to make it puff tiny clouds of smoke. I spent hours watching that train circle its track, imagining I was at the helm, guiding it through dense forests, vast fields, towering mountains, and quaint little towns. When I turned 10, my grandparents gave me a Lionel train set for my birthday. To this day, I still think it was the best gift ever. The set came with a steam engine and 4 passenger cars. It even included a small bottle of liquid you could pour into the smokestack to make it puff tiny clouds of smoke. I spent hours watching that train circle its track, imagining I was at the helm, guiding it through dense forests, vast fields, towering mountains, and quaint little towns. As I grew older, my interests expanded especially when it came to girls. But my fascination with trains never faded. Years later, when I had the chance to apply for a position as an engineer trainee with MATA, I seized it. Landing that job felt like a dream coming to life. After completing the required training and exams, I soon found myself sitting in the cab of one of those sleek diesel engines, preparing to guide commuter trains along their routes. The trainee program was designed so that you would ride different lines in the system for several months alongside an experienced engineer. I would spend a few weeks on one line before being reassigned to another, allowing me to become familiar with the various routes. The M operates 8 routes, each one numbered. The main line is line 1, while the branch lines are designated as line 2, line 3, and so on. I began my training on line 7 for the first few weeks, then transitioned to line 8. Line 8, often referred to as the Cloverton line, is one of the longest branch lines in the system, surpassed only by line 2, known as the Millersport line. On my first ride along line 8, I was paired with a veteran engineer named Hank. Hank had been with the company since its inception, when the old railroads opted to exit the unprofitable commuter services and transferred all their locomotives and rolling stock to MATA. We operated the night hour service, which began at 7 p.m. and concluded at 5 in the morning. We picked up our first passengers at Central Station and soon set off for Cloverton. As we traveled down the tracks, Hank turned to me and said, "There's something you need to know if you're going to work for this railroad, especially if they decide to assign you to Line 8 once you become an official engineer." Curious, I asked. "Oh, and what's that?" Hank paused to blow the horn for a crossing and then replied, "This line is haunted." "Haunted? How is the line haunted?" I asked, intrigued. Hank explained. It supposedly began with a curse. Back in the late 1800s, one of the old railroad companies was constructing the line and built it across the edge of a farm owned by a man named Ezra Gray without his consent. Ezra demanded that the railroad remove the tracks from his property and relocate them, but the railroad refused, citing the high costs in time and money. He attempted to sue the railroad, but was unsuccessful. Railroads were quite powerful back then, with many politicians and judges in their pocket. To make matters worse, Ezra not only had to cover his court costs, but also had to pay the railroad for their legal expenses. This left him bankrupt, forcing him to sell the farm, except for the small patch of land where the tracks were laid. Ezra Gray vowed to seek revenge. When the line finally opened, Ezra stood on the tracks in front of the first train. The engineer tried to stop, but Ezra was struck anyway. Before he died, Ezra cursed the line, proclaiming it would bring death and sorrow. Ever since, there have been numerous mishaps and accidents on these tracks, leading to many lives lost. It's believed that some of those who perished haunt various locations, and that some of the trains that crashed over the years return as ghost trains, still traveling along the very rails we're on now. I looked at Hank as he blew the horn for another crossing. "Have you ever seen any ghosts on this line?" I asked. "Plenty," he replied. "I've seen everything from headless trainmen to phantom lights and ghost trains." Initially, I didn't believe him, but kept my thoughts to myself. As we approached a curve in the track, something caught my eye that made my blood run cold. A headlight from another train was coming toward us. "Hank, for God's sake, put the brakes on," I shouted. "Don't you see the other train coming our way?" Hank calmly responded, "Yeah, I see it. Don't worry, we'll be fine." I looked at Hank, panic rising in me. "Are you crazy? We're about to die." Hank simply pointed straight ahead. "No, we're not. Take a good look at that train." I did, and I noticed that the approaching engine resembled one of the older diesel models, like those seen in photos, movies, and TV shows from the 50s and 60s. But it appeared to be a transparent shadow, complete with a headlight and illuminated cab windows. "What the—" I began to say, but then that shadow train passed through us. It didn't hit us, exactly. It felt more like it passed right through our cab. Shadows and streaks of light surrounded us as what appeared to be a passenger train moved by, and I swear I saw pale, wispy figures of people sitting in the seats. Before I knew it, the shadow train was gone, and the cab of our engine returned to normal. "What the hell was that?" I exclaimed. Hank turned to me and replied, "That was one of the ghost trains I was telling you about." "What's the story behind that ghost train?" I asked. eager to know more. Hank sighed and explained, "Well, this all started shortly after Marta was established and took over the commuter rail lines. An evening inbound train had just crested the long grade we're currently on when it lost control and raced downhill, eventually crashing and piling up on the curve at the bottom. Everyone on board perished, and the wreck was attributed to the aging equipment Marta was using at the time, with only a few exceptions. Most of the engines Marta acquired from the old railroads were between 25 to 30 years old, and about 30% of the coaches were even older. Not long after the accident, the ghost of that train began appearing along this stretch of track, becoming one of several ghost trains that haunt these rails." I looked at him, then turned to gaze out the front window of the engine. "What about the people in the cars? Do you think they witnessed what we just saw?" I asked. Hank shrugged and replied, "Probably, but I bet most of them are accustomed to it, so I wouldn't worry too much. Our conductor is probably handling things right now." We continued on to Cloverton and arrived on schedule. We made several runs back and forth throughout the night, and I encountered some of the eerie things Hank had mentioned. I felt relieved when we finally tied up in the yard, leaving the coaches on one of the side tracks and parked the engine in the roundhouse. However, the next few nights were a nightmare. Each night run, I experienced at least a few unsettling encounters along Line 8, all alongside Hank, who dismissed them as if they were nothing unusual. After nearly 40 years on the job, I suppose the ghosts no longer troubled him. After a few days, I was assigned to the day runs, which was a relief, as I didn't have to worry about ghost trains or headless trainmen anymore. I eventually became a regular engineer and was placed on the main line run. I'm pretty content, but if the higher-ups at the M ever decide to assign me to the Line 8 night owl service, I would definitely quit.